You are listening to NeoTalk, the official podcast of the Faculty of Modern Languages at the University of Warsaw. I'm Maria Usakowska. We live in the Anthropocene, an epoch characterized by the impact of humans on the environment. I think it is safe to say that up to this point, the 21st century has been defined by the climate crisis scare. Today, it is not only scientists who try to raise the social consciousness about the danger of it, but also journalists, artists, filmmakers, and poets. Some of them, with help from scientists, draw inspiration from the strangest of the Earth's organisms, such as lichens, and create ecocritical poetry that practices non-anthropocentric subjectivity. In today's conversation with two special guests, poet Forrest Gander and mycologist Anne Pringle, we discuss whether it is possible for humans to abandon their anthropocentric worldview. We talk about their collaboration, lichens, ecopoetics, and how intimacy, as it turns out, is not a strictly human practice. Anne Pringle is a distinguished professor of botany at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is an ecologist and evolutionary biologist exploring the biology of fungi. She has received many prizes and a Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study Fellowship. She is also a public speaker and a spokesperson for fungi. Forrest Gander is a professor emeritus of literary arts and comparative literature at Brown University, an essayist, translator, and poet. In 2019, he won a Pulitzer Prize for his collection Be With. In this episode, we are focusing on his newest collection of poetry, Twice Alive, lately translated into Polish by Julia Fedorczuk. I really hope that this fascinating conversation will convince you to read this exceptional collection, and I hope that you enjoy this episode. Welcome to NeoTalk. I'm very honored to host you both here today. This is a very exceptional episode, obviously, not only because there are two guests, but also because one of them is a biologist, which might seem a little bit unusual considering the theme of our podcast. But to our listeners, I promise that everything will fall into place. So, Forrest Gander and Anne Pringle, you are visiting here at the University of Warsaw, and we are recording this right before your lecture called The Persistence of Dispersed Worlds on the Impossibility of Alliance Between Poetry and Science. And in this lecture, as far as I understand, you will ponder the idea of description and how there are different modes of description, for example, the poetic and the scientific. I will want to go back to the topic of your talk. However, I'd like to start with a maybe more down-to-earth question, because Forrest, you are a poet and an artist, and Anne, you are a mycologist, as you said earlier in our email exchange, a very traditional, straightforward scientist. So I'm curious about how did your paths cross, and what made you decide to collaborate?
We were invited into this project by a scholar, a literary critic named Lynn Keller, who had just published a book called Recomposing Ecopoetics, North American Poetry in the Self-Conscious Anthropocene. And she thought it would be useful to put together a scientist, a poet, an artist, and the scientists' club of grad students, and do a project together. So we went up to an incredible place called the Huron Mountain Club, where, in a bizarre coincidence, my editor at New Directions in New York is a member, and it's a very exclusive private land that was organized in the late 1800s by 50 fairly wealthy families who were concerned that because of their own industries, for example, the timber industry, there wasn't going to be enough forest left in the United States for hunting. And so they bought this land, and they had the good fortune of asking an important naturalist named Aldo Leopold to give them guidance on how to keep the land preserved. So it's 20,000 acres and it includes several lakes and 10,000 acres of old-growth forest. And although it's private, it's now become open to researchers like Anne and other scientists. And that's where we went.
What did you do there? What was the project?
The project was about communication, and that's the way that I think about these things. I am a very traditionally trained scientist, but science only goes so far when it's published in academic journals. And in order to have the science matter beyond, I would say, you have to be quite open to other ideas of talking. And so for me, the appeal of the collaboration was different people who talk to different audiences or talk in different ways or communicate in different ways, to have different thoughts about the things that I'm looking at and have my own particular thoughts about. So the project honestly was about walking in the woods, looking, observing, and talking, and having reactions and hearing other people's reactions, and then having your own reactions to what other people were saying. And I think, one of the things I took out of those walks in the woods was watching my graduate students, who also, like me, are receiving a very traditional education, and having them have new ideas about how one could look at a lichen or a mushroom, and how one could talk about it, and whether it was okay to talk to outsiders, I would say. I think that's one of the things my graduate students are always very worried about, is talking to outsiders and saying the wrong thing. And I think on that level, it's more important to connect and communicate than it is to always be exactly right about everything you're saying, although, of course, you strive for accuracy. But it's more important just to talk and get the conversation going.
And what was the outcome of the project?
When Anne says we just walked in the woods, I've spent, my childhood in Virginia walking through the woods and have a degree in geology. And I've done a lot of walking. But this is the first time of walking through the woods, really focused on the ground below me. And Anne sharpened our eyes to the things she studies, which are mushrooms and lichen, which turned out to be everywhere around us. We gathered so many samples, and it was a complete revelation to me to see what had always been around me and what I'd nevertheless been unaware of most of the time.
Is there a place where both of your interests overlap in a way? Because something made you decide to do this project together. My first thought was ecocriticism, that maybe in what you're doing, you have a similar approach to nature.
No, I don't think so. I don't even know what that word means still,
Okay.
if I'm honest. So it's not about that, but it is something about something that doesn't quite have that academic word attached to it, something about being in the world and noticing the world and bearing witness to change. And again, the word communication comes to my mind, communicating about change. So I would argue the thing we have in common is noticing and asking questions. Yeah, and seeking answers. I don't know whether we ever get to an answer. Sometimes I feel like I get to unanswer, and it raises many more questions. So it never quite seems like the journey is over. But I think the idea of any kind of collaboration that thinks about not just our shared humanity, but our shared worlds, I'm going to stake a claim to that. I think that's the point in common. And you asked about products. It's funny. I'm not sure that there's a particular endpoint project. I mean, I think there have been things that have been touched by this conversation. I think your book is clearly something that was touched by our conversation. Emily Arthur, who's the artist that we have been collaborating with, has a quite astonishing set of artwork that has been years in the making and is still probably another year or two in the making. But when her art is complete, it will be a testament to this conversation. Maybe it's the conversation itself that is the product, if you will.
Which is a process.
Yeah.
And that is ongoing. That's what we're going to do here. Yeah. And Anne and I have met again in California, and we'll do so some more. So it's an ongoing query into, as Anne said, sort of the human relationship with the world and attentiveness, an attentive state of being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the way I feel about it is our world is in trouble. And we have this expression, all hands on deck, which is an old naval expression, I suppose. And it means everyone on it, think about it now. So I don't think that these things that we're grappling with as a world can only be done by scientists or can only be done by poets or can only be done by government or can only be done by whatever you wish to name. It demands creative ways of thinking and talking. And I don't want to sound too grand. I don't think that 2 people or 3 people or 5 people in a room are going to quite get it done, but it does at least push a little bit. And any place you can push, you should push.
I want to talk about Forrest's book because I first heard about you in the context of Ecopoetics. And as I understand, Ecopoetics investigates the dominant cultural modes of thinking. So a little bit actually what you're talking about here, Anne, because these modes of thinking are governed by, rationalism, anthropocentrism. Ecocriticism basically emphasizes the connection between humans and their environment, right? Humans and the non-human identities. But I want to ask you, Forrest, in your work as a poet, as an artist, how is your work ecopoetic? What does it mean to you? Yeah, how do you express it?
Well, that term is still troubling to me, ecopoetry, ecopoetics. But given the existential threat heralded by the new climate regime we find ourselves in, many of us, including poets, are wondering how we might counter this imminent ecological disaster and what kinds of subjectivities need to be forged, human or non-human, that can respond to the Earth's crisis, and what possible new aesthetic forms might need to be invented. As Anne said, I think it's going to take a chorus of voices because scientists have been feeding us the facts of ecological collapse for most of our lives, and yet the facts alone haven't been persuasive enough for us to make the kinds of changes that our culture needs to make. So perhaps the sociological, scientific, and journalistic language for dealing with this crisis has been insufficient, and if so, maybe literature, including poetry, has a role to play. But then what if, even in a small way, poetry might help to resensitize us to a clearer understanding of our place in the world? What if it can help us rewrite history and refashion human consciousness? So the big question we deal with is, can poetry be ecological? Can it really display or be invested with values that acknowledge the economy of interrelationship between human and non-human realms? Because in Polish, as well as in English and most European and Eastern literatures, there's long traditions of the pastoral, which is a poetry centered on nature or landscape. But with the other so-called ecopoetics, I'm far less interested in nature poetry, where nature features merely as a theme, than in poetry sometimes called ecopoetry that investigates, both formally and thematically, the relationship between nature and culture, language and perception. So the interesting thing about ecopoetics, for me, one of the most interesting things, is that if we think about any literary or artistic movement, we are generally thinking of something that originated in a single city, often Paris, and was founded by usually a small group of men. But ecopoetics has flourished partly because of the internet all at once, all over the world, and from the start, it's been represented by writers of all genders. And among the most distinctive of these writers are Inger Christensen from Denmark, Harriet Tarlow and Zoe Skaulding in the United Kingdom, Franz Josef Czernin in Germany, Anja Utler in Austria, Coral Bracho, Alfonso de Quino, Yaxkin Melchi in Mexico, John Kinsella, Stuart Cook in Australia, in Poland, Julia Fjodorczyk, Matt Solderland in Sweden, Cecilia Vicuña and Raúl Zorita in Chile, and lots of writers that I'm familiar with in the U.S., including Brenda Hillman and Jory Graham.
When you are writing poetry, are there specific structures or words that you use to express this kind of ecosystem that you were talking about?
So I don't think there's any one way at all. I think we're all probing. And when I write, I'm thinking about music, I'm thinking about pacing and rhythm and sonic relations and syntax and lexical precision. I think there are ways of using those sorts of things to deconstruct a constant point of view of the I, controlling its objects, its world of objects. And there are also ethical dimensions. There was, for example, do you remember a musician, a pop star named Sade?
Yeah, of course.
Uh-huh. So Sade became famous in the 80s. In her song Pearls, she sings and writes about a starving African woman. There's a woman in Somalia, she sings, scraping for pearls on the roadside. And through the song, she's dying, she's crying out to heaven. And then Sade writes, she lives a life she didn't choose, and it hurts like brand new shoes. And the inadequacy of that analogy made by a singer who started her career in the fashion world as a model is not just a failure of imagination, but it's a moral failure. The pain of starving to death is not like the discomfort of a new pair of Jimmy Choos. And it's instructive to compare that analogy to an analogy that Pablo Neruda's makes in a poem about fascist crimes in Spanish Civil War, just to show you how a poet might be thinking. His poem, called Explico algunas cosas, I explain a few things, includes the lines, Neruda writes, y por las calles la sangre de los niños corría simplemente como sangre de niños. And the blood of the children ran in the street simply like the blood of children. And his refusal to make an analogy there is an ethical choice, because what are you going to compare that to that's going to make it a stronger image? As a poet and as an eco-poet, I think you're thinking of all of that, the music, the ethics. And ecopoetics is a trajectory away from the mimetic and representational modes that have dominated nature writing towards a more complicated and self-implicated exploration of nature that understands nature to include the human, along with toxic waste dumps, styrofoam, city-sized dumps of discarded computer parts in China, and human overpopulation.
Do you think in your scientific work, is it possible to kind of step away from this anthropocentric perspective that Forrest is talking about? Because you are dedicating your work to other non-human organisms, right? But you're still doing it from, you are a human person, so it is basically impossible for you to completely reject that perspective. But I'm thinking, do you think there's a way of doing this science that is not centered around humans?
It's a great question. Also, Forrest, thank you for that.
That was beautiful.
That was really, I'm thinking quite a lot about that right now. Because, of course, scientists also use words and also try to use language to convey a meaning that's more than just the words being strung together. I think that's clear. So now I'm thinking about words and how they get put together. It's such a challenge to study other kingdoms as a human, which may sound like an odd statement, but it is something that I think a lot about. I think a lot about humans being visual creatures. We study with our eyes almost as much as, almost more in a way than with any other sense. But fungi, for example, mushrooms don't see each other. I know that will be a shock and a revelation to your audience. So I'm constantly thinking about interpreting visual evidence and what it means to use your eyes to study something that doesn't see. The theme of language, I've been thinking about that a lot lately because in the United States, as the students I teach challenge the use of he and she as a binary and challenge human binaries. Fungi have never had a binary, and it's something that I teach every year in my mycology class. And my joke, but it's only partly a joke, is that I could always tell in my class who was struggling with issues of sexual identity when I taught about fungal sex, because I would get to the point where I would say there is no sex and this is how it plays out. And you could see in their faces the emotion and somehow it was always very poignant. But one of the things that some scientists do still, one of my students pointed out to me that she, and her pronoun is she pointed out to me in a paper where someone had tried to describe fungal individuals as either he or she, depending on whether they, I think in this paper, depending on whether they received or donated a nucleus. And so somehow the act of receiving or giving was equated to be male or female. And so this particular set of authors decided that one body was a he and the other body was a she, which is completely wrong. And, I think about language a lot and our limitations, both in terms of our senses and our language. And I do think it hinders our ability to truly understand. I do.
In your book, Forrest, Twice Alive, it is a collection of poetry. By the way, it's translated into Polish, so my Polish listeners, you're welcome to read it as well in your native language. So in the author's note, you talk about lichens, and you describe how their ecology has more to do with collaboration than competition. And also you write about how they reproduce, which is asexually. And you write that this kind of way that they collaborate is evocative of a certain type of intimacy. And we will go back to your poetry and lichens, but I want to ask Anne first, what is so interesting about them? Why are they such special organisms?
Lichens are special organisms because to our eyes, back to the theme of what we see, it looks like a thing, like a bird, like you should be able to count it and understand it. It doesn't look like a multiplicity of things. It looks like one thing. And so for people who've seen lichens on trees or fence posts or rocks, it's quite intuitive. If they're isolated circular individuals, it's quite intuitive to look at them and say, oh, I think I have a sense of what that's all about. It's like a squirrel or some unitary animal, but that's not true. And in fact, hundreds of years ago, a few biologists began to recognize that that thing that is perceived so easily is actually a composite, if you will. It's one fungus that creates the scaffolding of the organism, and then it's many other organisms that inhabit that scaffolding. And in the aggregate, the individuals, the organisms, the cells all together make up the thallus or the body that you perceive to be a lichen. So it's a fungus, it's a photosynthetic algae, but then there are many other kinds of fungi that inhabit the body, bacteria, even animals that seem to make their home inside a lichen. So once you start learning about a lichen, it seems more like a world than it does a bird, although we could talk about that. Birds also have things inside them, but there is some difference there between a bird and a lichen, and we could talk about that if you want. But a lichen is truly an integrated set of co-inhabitants or collaborators or symbionts. I like the word symbiosis, actually, because it's relatively free of human connotations. Other words become quite complicated, I think, when you use them for a lichen. And I think the other thing that's really important about a lichen is it has emergent properties that only exist when all of the bits are together. So even the appearance of a lichen is only possible because it has a fungus and algae and other fungi and other things inside it. And we don't really understand how that works. Lichens are not very well studied. There are not very many people who study them. There are not enough of us. We don't have enough tools. We don't have enough space and time. So I would argue that on the whole, we understand less about lichens than we understand less than we know, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Mm-hmm. We don't know much more than we do know about how lichens work.
Yeah, something that I read while researching this was also that we as humans, we are also full of other organisms, right? So yes, we perceive ourselves as one, but there are so many other things that live inside of us. But also another fascinating thing about lichens, I think, is that it seems that they are, in a way, immortal. This is something that I read, and also, could you maybe talk about that also?
Yeah, and let me define aging first. So just so that we're all on the same page, aging can be defined in this way. As a human, when you get older, your probability of dying increases. So a person who is 15 years old is less likely to die in any given year than a person who is 90 years old. So that's aging, this increasing probability of death with time. Similarly, your chances of reproduction also go down with time. A woman who's 15 years old, there's a possibility that that person will have a baby. A woman who's 90 years old is not going to have a baby. So the probability of reproduction goes down with time. So if you take that very clear definition of aging and you look at a lichen, things get turned on their heads, because as time passes, a lichen gets larger, not smaller. And a lichen that is larger has a higher probability of persisting, of living, of making it through the next year. And lichens reproduce proportionately to how large they are. So there's more reproduction as a thallus gets older, not less. There's some things we don't know about that dynamic. So I don't want people to think that this is a fact and absolute. There are still lots of questions that I have about how that works, but as a sort of a broad brush, we can think about it that way. And so then I thought about this question for a long time. I start to think that we're actually asking the wrong questions, that from our human perspective, aging is all-consuming. We want to know about it, but I'm not sure whether that's the right question to ask of a lichen. Do you age? I think we could talk about it more if you like, but there are other questions to ask. So, but that's the basic idea.
What?
I think it's not so much about that body that you count. I want everyone to think about a rock and lichens growing on a rock and circles on a rock. Each circle is a lichen. And I think we tend to focus on the one circle and what's the dynamic with that one circle. Is it here this year? Will it be here next year? And I think instead of thinking that way, we should more think about the lineage, about the circle and all the other circles that are the offspring of that circle or the parents of that circle or the siblings of that circle, and start thinking more holistically about lineages.
And here's where Anne and Ecopoetics are in sync, because what she's talking about is that there's a plurality of worlds, that if we look from the mammalian point of view constantly, if that's how we construct all our questions, we're going to miss a whole different way of being in the world, which different creatures have.
Considering what we just talked about, the originality of this organism, the aspect of aging and death, I think the topic of death appears here also, and the collaborative aspect of this organism. Forrest, could you talk about how lichens maybe inspired you to write Twice Alive, or how were they important to this work?
All the credit goes to Anne Pringle. I learned so much from her.
And shaking her head.
And she set me on a course of intense reading. But so one of the things about lichen is the main organisms that come together don't continue to stand as they did beforehand. They're changed in their contact. And that made me think of intimacy, of how in a long relationship where we're with somebody, that there are ways that we merge, that we give up part of what we were and we take on different attributes. So whatever its virtues, humanism is focused on just the human organism at the expense of ignoring how that organism is conditioned by and dependent on its relation to a world of others and otherness. Humanism has also elevated logos, among other ways, above other ways of knowing. This thing Wittgenstein says, so many things that he says have been really important to me, but the famous pronouncement that the limits of my language mean the limits of my world suggests that the structures of language privilege certain modes of thought and preclude others. And if language does shape what we know and who we are, then poets want to be alert to techniques that might generate fresh ways of engaging with the world. I think that's very much what Anne's engaged in also. It's true I used lichens in Twice Alive as a post-humanist metaphor, but it's just a metaphor. It's not some definitive or exclusive way of looking at lichens or looking at human intimacy. It's just one way that might serve to prompt us to reconsider our habits of thinking and perceiving of the human place in so-called nature. But there are endless ways. As John Ashbery, great American poet, puts it, it could always have been written differently.
I want to kind of continue this topic also of intimacy, because Forrest, you write about lichens and their reproduction. The thought of two things that merge, mutually altering each other, two things that intermingled and interactive become one thing that does not age, brings me to think of the nature of intimacy. Isn't it often in our most intimate relations that we come to realize that our identity, all identity, is combinatory? So first, maybe I want to ask Forrest, after asking these questions, very interesting questions, did you come to any conclusions about how our identity is related to our intimacy?
Well, yes, but as Anne said, it's not the conclusions that interest me so much as the questions. But certainly the notion that Descartes projects that I think, therefore I am, that you can think in some space that's not already engaged with the world, is no longer acceptable as a mode of philosophy, that there's no place to stand where you're not engaged already with something else that's not you, that's a world. And I was writing this book in the wake of the death of my wife of 35 years, the great American poet C.D. Wright, thinking about how the intimate relationship that we had developed over all that time had changed us so radically, and that it was something that would live on in time. I would never lose it. It was going to be a part of my reality. And so that notion of intimacy is connected to what Anne was talking to me about with lichen, and that's how those things came together. The conclusion is just, I think, that we exist, as you just mentioned, Maria, that our bodies are a collaboration of organisms, that our existence is always a collaboration with others, and in those collaborations, we're profoundly changed. And that I've found to be the most beautiful thing in my life.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about how if only one aspect, only one, for example, relationship in our life changes, we would be probably completely different people, right? We are like the sum of the things that we experienced and the sum of the relationships that we have and the bacteria that we have in our bodies, right?
Right.
And kind of continuing on this topic of relationships, I want to ask Anne, because I visited your website of the Pringle Lab, which is so lovely. And on the homepage, you state that the missions of the Pringle Lab are to publish excellent science and have a lot of fun as we make our discoveries. Our twin aims are data and joy. Would you say that the connections between people, the joy of being and working together, is this something that makes your research somehow different?
Yeah, thanks for noticing that we've worked so hard on that mission statement. Yeah, I mean, science is a very human endeavor. As much as I would like to abstract science from the humans who do it, it's not possible. And I think if you've got people who are friends and interacting and helping each other, also challenging each other, you've got your science will be much better. Yeah, there's almost nothing more important in science than collaborations and friendships. It's what makes it go. I mean, of course, you have to be smart. You have to have money because you have to collect the data, and that takes money. You have to have skills. You have to be able to think. You have to be able to analyze data, write. There are many skills. But almost above all that, you have to have relationship and good ones to make your science happen. And it's, it's somehow in those conversations and in those, in the touchings, I guess, that your thinking reshapes itself, and that's how you get to something really new, I think, I'm sure. I think it's hard to think. It's hard to think, and it's hard to think beyond or outside or reach differently for how to think about something. It's also really difficult to recognize when you've got something new in your data. I think there's a lot of science that happens, including in my own lab, where it's the logical next step, and there is value in that as well. But of course, when you can contribute something that really reshapes how we think, that's the gold star. That's the thing that really keeps me going, is if I can really reshape thinking about something. And there you have to have all your senses open to be able to recognize in the data or in your thoughts or however it is in your own world. You have to be able to recognize what's new or what's wrong or what to keep or what to discard. It's all very challenging, and the friendships make you better.
Is it similar when you're working as a poet, artist?
You might think at first that it's not, that, there's a romantic image of the poet and the isolated garret writing the works of genius. But as Cormac McCarthy said, books come from books. And I can recite poetry for hours. All of what I've read is inside me and has transformed me. So when I write, I'm having a conversation with all the writers that have come before me and who are part of my current company, in addition to it being my own wrestling match with language.
I want to come back to your poetry collection, Twice Alive, because I want to ask you about the very interesting structure of some of your poems. Some of them have these dots that divide the text, and sometimes also some words are in bold, and sometimes you even have these lines that connect the verses, which to me evoked some sort of a simplistic drawing of a tree root system, for example. I don't know if that's a good connotation. So I must assume it was not coincidental. So could you talk a little bit about that? Where did this choice come from?
Again, it's similar to what Anne was just saying, that the gold star is not thinking in conventions, is being able to be open to the possibility of seeing something new, hearing something new, being aware of something. That attentiveness that's outside the normal ruts of our perception. Because we all live in these ruts, these, the language phrases that we use every day that mean almost nothing, and the way we see things that are familiar to us, so that we don't see what's unfamiliar to us. It's one of the positive aspects of travel when we become foreign ourselves, and what we see stands out in relief against that familiar world we've left behind. So the dots that, they're bigger than dots, but I don't know what else to call them either, are a way of breaking up. English naturally falls into an iambic pentameter. It's sort of the voice phrasing, the sentence phrasing that contemporary English is comfortable in. And I'm trying to interrupt that at places where we're expecting the rhythm to be terminated and instead it goes on, or we're expecting it to go on, but there's this dot blocking the way. And it just adjusts our expectations and maybe creates it's called a caesura, this break between the parts of a sentence that can be almost an erotic space where we're waiting for the sentence to complete itself, but there's this interval that we have to pass through. And those lines in some of the poems that you've mentioned I was writing about redwood trees a lot, and I'm living in California, and I was writing a series of poems based on redwood trees and looking at the bark structure and the root structure of redwood trees and thinking, why can't a poem incorporate some of this structure into the poem structure? And the question that's most frequently asked of me with regard to that book, Twice Alive, has to do with the title poem, which happens in 3 parts. And there are words in it that are bold-faced. And more people have asked me, why are certain words bold-faced? And my intention was to add a different texture to, again, the sort of notion that inside one life are other lives. Inside one texture might be other textures. That there's a plurality of worlds engaged with each other. And that was part of the reason for that.
Also, when you talk about texture, and I'm thinking how you've been kind of inspired by lichens in nature in general. Nature has a lot of texture. Like when you go out in the woods, right, you can touch so many different textures. And yeah, I think it's very beautiful. A very nice kind of, I think, illustration also of what the world around us is, right? It's not like just simple two-dimensional thing on a page, right? It's like three-dimensional or even more. And also, I want to circle back to your talk in Warsaw. Its title is The Persistence of Dispersed Worlds, which is also the title of a chapter in Forrest's poetry collection and also a title of a segment in Anne's article, Establishing New Worlds, the Lichens of Petersham, which I also recommend. It was very interesting. So I assume it was not a coincidence that you used the same phrase in your work, or was it a coincidence? I wanted to ask, what are the dispersed worlds, basically?
Okay, so first of all, I think it is a coincidence.
Really?
No, I'm constantly plagiarizing Anne, basically. I try to make as little changes.
Okay, so Forrest, was this a conscious choice then?
Well, it is partly based on, I was thinking about Anne's description of the potential immortality of lichens and how a lichen disperses its genetic code into the world and so continues to live beyond itself. And I think that's partly what influenced me to title my recent book, Twice Alive. That title reminds me and reminds us that there is a plurality of worlds, not just one in which humans carry on their commerce. There's, again, another wonderful thing that Wittgenstein says. He says, if a lion could talk in like a human language, we would not understand what it says. Like the bee experiences a completely different world from the world that we live in. If it could talk, it wouldn't be thinking in any kinds of the structures that our brain thinks in. So have I gone completely off the topic and forgotten what you said?
No. We're still talking about
so that the persistence of dispersed worlds. Thinking of the plurality of worlds, and then thinking of Anne's notion of dispersal of genetic material.
One of the things I'm thinking about as I listen is it matters somehow also how the world is built, whether an entity is dispersing entire replicate sets of itself, if that makes sense. So if a world is sending off smaller worlds, or as sometimes happens, a world is sending off a subset of itself, a subset of the world, and then that world is rebuilt. And I think that those are two very different ways of moving through space and time. And they do matter in ways that I don't think are very well articulated or thought about. I think for humans, we're more of the kind that send off bits of ourselves somehow in the next generation, if you want to think about it that way. And those entities rebuild themselves, whereas a lichen is more likely, not always, because of course there are 35,000 species of lichens, so there are not exactly universal rules, or we don't know yet what the universal rules might be. But a lichen is more likely to send off an entire replicate set, an entire built world, if you want to think about it that way.
You were talking to me earlier today about how distinct that is from the way a forest might be considered reproducing itself.
Yeah, I think a forest does not reproduce itself. I think people like to take the image of a lichen and somehow turn it into a metaphor for large communities, a grassland or a forest or an ocean. That is where it no longer works. I think that's not right. And to take the example of a forest does not send off an acre of packaged forest to 10 miles distance and it reestablishes itself. A forest might grow at its edges, but how it grows is because trees within the forest send off seeds, and the seeds land at the edge of the forest. And if a farmer is no longer farming a plot of land, or an edge of the forest is no longer being mowed, or for whatever reason, the environment changes, the manipulation changes, then those trees can establish. And then,
but it's not all the trees.
Not all the trees, yeah. Yeah, not all, just first pines and then hardwoods come and the animals will come later, and a forest doesn't replicate itself. That is something to keep in mind, yeah.
So speaking about the forests and how also important they are to us, I want to mention climate crisis, which of course we have kind of touched upon here a little bit. But also there's this story that, as Forrest mentioned earlier, that the scientists actually were alarming the world about the climate changes and climate crisis eventually since probably like the 1970s. But the problem was that the scientific language was not really reaching people, right? So scientists were publishing even more articles to prove even more, but still it wasn't really read. And then I think that what actually made us really consider this problem was that it turned out that it's not the like rational scientific arguments that speak to us, but the strongest ones are kind of the emotional ones or the most vivid ones. So, you know, like we ask questions like, what planet do I want my kids to live on? Or what about all the sweet turtles that are eating plastic, right? This is like an image that is very vivid of all these animals trapped in, you know, plastic cans or something. Or even slogans such as, there are no books on a dead planet, right? For those who are avid readers and care about that. So I guess I wanted to ask you, do you think poetry can be also a way of convincing people about these issues? And if so, is there a responsibility that artists or poets have when it comes to environmental issues or social issues?
People are constantly saying that poetry, well, I mean, one of our great poets says poetry makes nothing happen. But I think making small changes can have repercussions that are large. And also I think that at this moment in time where we're living in an age of spectacle and we're being bombarded by images constantly, and our language is being reduced to tweets and emojis, and the fullness of our emotional lives and psychological lives aren't being articulated well for people. And that's drawing people. I can speak for the United States, where the reading of poetry has increased logarithmically over the last 15 years. And the greatest increase in that readership is among young people and people of color. And I think that in a time when so much is passing so quickly before our eyes, and the information that comes at us can't be metabolized, that people are looking for something that matters, that drags its anchor across the deep mud of their soul. And that's what's causing people to look for poetry, that it can make a difference, that the human animal is an animal that's given to offering its world to others in forms of language.
I also think that it can be a source of consolation.
And that too. Well, I wouldn't tell anyone else what or how to write. Some poets go on writing now witty, ironic, conventional verse during the greatest ecological crisis in human history. I wouldn't necessarily say that they're like Nero, who, according to rumor, fiddled while Rome burned, although the fiddle actually wasn't invented for hundreds of years later. Artists contribute what they can in their own way. We're each given to write just what we feel given to write about. A lot of us feel like writing into this crisis, but not everyone. And eventually, no matter what we write, it'll all disappear.
That's a little bit sad, but yeah, I mean, I think ultimately you're right. Well, thank you so much. Forrest Gander and Anne Pringle were my guests today, and I hope you enjoyed this conversation. And thank you so much for flying across the ocean to be here with me today.
It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Maria. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you. Goodbye. This was an episode of NeoTalk, the official podcast of the Faculty of Modern Languages at the University of Warsaw, recorded at Radio Campus. Franek Wójcicki edited this episode, and the cover art is by Weronika Rosik. You can find additional resources and books mentioned in the show notes. We encourage you to follow the Department of Modern Languages on Instagram and Facebook. If you have comments, questions, or suggestions for topics we could cover, email us. My name is Maria Łusakowska. Thanks for listening.